Like other than that, I can't figure out why it's happening now with all the rain and everything.
Yeah,
it's
really strange.
Well, thanks everybody for coming. So, Bruce, if you want to say your question again.
Sure. So what prompted your initial, I guess, inquiry into this topic or this particular question?
Yeah, so I grew up in a conservative Christian home, so it was more of a listening to whatever talk radio was on and being like, okay, here's people talking about it, formulate your own opinions kind of thing. And then Michael Medved was one of the guys that we listened to probably the most and was our favorite, and he's Jewish. I remember him talking one day about you have to ban some drugs because they can be really dangerous. And so that was sort of like my default position, first thing that I ever latched onto. It's like, oh, drugs that are so powerful, you couldn't get off of them even if you wanted to, by yourself kind of thing. And then from there, started getting introduced into more of the, prohibition was a disaster, and we all see how that went. So because you can't do it with alcohol, you can't do it with anything. And so moved into more of a libertarian line of thinking. And then from there, I remember for several years telling people the Bible doesn't really say anything about drugs other than don't get drunk. But in terms of making laws against selling drugs or making drugs, there really isn't anything, which is true. But then some people would take that and run with it and be like, oh, okay, I can do drugs and the Bible doesn't have a problem with that. And so now there's actually 2 passages in the Old Testament that I've found. There might be more, but one of them is sort of lesser, sort of half applies to this. And then there's another one that obviously is a lot more central. So the one that kind of half applies is the passages that talk about don't be a medium or a spiritist or a necromancer, for example. The word for medium, that's translated medium in Hebrew, it's used in one other place in the book of Job, and it means wineskin. And so it has to do with maybe occult stuff that has to do with drug use and getting yourself into a trance and hallucinations,
LSDs
like that.
Yeah.
Could be. So we know with Saul's witch at Endor thing that type of stuff is real, and so drugs could be used. There's Ecuadorian witch doctors and stuff that will use drugs to heal people and speak to spirits and things like that.
Yeah.
So that one's maybe a little bit less familiar to us in modern day America. How many witch doctors do you know?
Not a whole lot.
Yeah, me neither. So the other one is that's much more central is if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who's a glutton and a drunkard. If y'all are familiar with that passage, it's in I believe it's Deuteronomy 21:18, and I'll just read this whole passage here. It's 4 verses. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and though they discipline him, will not listen to them, then his father and his mother shall take a hold of him and bring him out to the city, to the elders of his city at the gate of the place where he lives. And they shall say to the elders of his city, this our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, and all Israel shall hear and fear. So one of the reasons that I asked spouses to be present is because it's not just it's not the father making the decision. It's not the mother making the decision. It's both parents in unison have to say, this kid is so far gone, it's time to take him to the city elders for his execution. And so I would tend to think that the mothers would have a much further breaking point than the father would. How far gone into drugs and alcohol does somebody have to be before your mom says, I think we need to execute our son? This is pretty far gone stuff. But there is a point. And it's it's not just the dad. It's the mom has to go along with it. What are y'all's reactions to that, thoughts?
This is a passage that's been debated. This particular one has been been back and forth for, I remember, the last 3 or 4 years at least, in my own head, and then also amongst several other people that I've talked to. Most people see this as an extreme, the most extreme punishment, and then we see a lot of the laws in Deuteronomy as perhaps measured, potential punishments. So you have, so if one thing happens, you could do this. This is the worst possible thing that could be done to this person. Or you could do this, or you could do that, and then of course you see Joseph in the New Testament, who with Mary, says, literally says he was a righteous man, not wanting to put her to shame, sought to put her away privately, when according to judicial law, she should have been, if we're reading it woodenly, she should have been put to death for adultery or something, But he was a righteous man. He loved her. He didn't want to put her to open shame, so he said, "No, I'm just gonna put you away quietly." So which I think is a good example of, okay, these things are measured. It's not you must always go to the max sort of thing. So with that particular one, it's a little bit tricky to say like, oh, this has to be every time something like that happens. Well, then you wait till there's we're all just kind of waiting on our waiting on the edge of our seat, like, oh no, is he going to get worse? When do we have to kill him?
Right.
It's a little bit less of that and a little bit more like, man, okay, this is showing us how much God cares about this sort of thing. This is something that's really, really important. Anytime there's the death penalty, God is putting a flag there that says, hey, this is really important to me, and you should take note of it. So we take note of it, we look at it, and we say, okay, yeah, like this is really, really important. And I think it's rather than a purely wooden judicial law, it's also a way to instruct parents in child rearing.
Yeah, it's at the discretion of the parents.
Yeah, don't let your kids get to this point. This is how important this is to God. This is not just he just gets drunk on the weekends sort of thing. It's like, no, like this is a big deal to the Lord.
Yeah, it starts from day one.
Yeah.
The way you train your child,
right,
to not get to that point.
Yeah. And I think it sets up a lot of social norms as well. Like, if socially getting drunk if it was on the books that if you were drunk, the fullest extent of the law, rather than like a $2 million fine, or 20 years in jail was actually execution, and it would be your own parents carrying that out. If that was on the books, then and that would look different, culturally. I think we'd have to weigh that out, but I think that would absolutely play a difference in what people think about getting drunk, or even doing drugs or that sort of thing.
Like, don't start down this path, because at the end there is death at the very end.
Big deal, yeah.
Instead of a social
like, oh,
safety
no,
social net.
Whoopsies, it's like, no, like you're literally in trouble with the law. Like today, it's just don't drink and drive, basically. Or, oh, we won't serve you more alcohol if you're inebriated, But getting drunk itself is not the problem. It's what you do when you're drunk. As opposed to this law is saying, oh, like actually being drunk, that action is also reprehensible by law, that sort of thing. So,
well, and the parents' part come into play as well. Like,
yeah.
This isn't somebody that's just his own individual, his own person off by himself. It's, if your parents are living there, they have a responsibility.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Thoughts, yeah. So, I kind of agree with you, I think, is basically what you're saying, is that this is an indication, as far as the use of this passage to us now, right? Because from what I understand from you, you're interested in potentially applying Old Testament jurisprudence in the modern day. Is that correct?
First it's just bringing it back to remembrance, and then we can figure out what to do with after then. But ultimately, yeah, I think it should be the inspiration for how we act, certainly.
Sure, yeah. And I mean, I think I agree with you that having this passage, while I don't believe necessarily you should be passing judgment and executing your kid for being a drunk necessarily as like a blanket rule, we are Catholic, and traditionally drunkenness is considered a mortal sin. It's a sin that takes away salvation, right? So it's considered a deadly sin, right? And so it is considered a sin of importance, and this passage from the Old Testament is, shows the importance of that, how serious it is, right? So I kind of basically agree with you. As far as now, though, and then applying this to drug law now is kind of, I think you wanted to, is kind of what you're implying here?
Well, funnily enough, I had a really curious experience yesterday. I was over at the courthouse in Pullman, or in Whitman County. It's up in Colfax. And there was a guy there that I have been ministering to for the last few years, and he had an appointment there. But immediately before his case, because they just do them in batches, there was a guy who had been in jail for the last 8 days and was being let go. But before they let him, they sentenced him to 364 days, suspended everything after the 8 days he had already been in jail indefinitely. So they were letting him out after sentencing him. And then the state attorney wanted to read a letter from the man's mom as the reason why she was asking for a 5-year no contact order against her son. And it was because he told the story was he was living at home. He was a grown man, like in his late 40s, I think. He was living with his mom. He asked his mom for a ride. His mom knew that he wanted to use that ride to go get more drugs. So she told him no.
Right.
And then the attorney said that there is a 44-minute video that she took of him having a breakdown and like smashing things in the house, tore the front door off its hinges. And then he read her letter, which was, I don't want to see you again for 5 years. So no contact order is no text, no email, no phone calls. You have to remain 1,000 feet away. You're not even allowed to pass messages through a third party. So 0 contact with his mom for 5 years, or else he's liable to go back to jail, and they're going to bring back that sentence they suspended. And I just remember the judge was like, well, sir, that's really sad. Your own mom wants a no contact order against you for her own safety. Like, at what point do you say this person is so rebellious? Now, obviously, in the state of Washington, there's no option for death penalty for, rebellious children. But the judge was just like, this is really sad. Like, if there's any sort of blanket, you're a rebellious human being, shouldn't your mom be that sort of final breaking point?
Yeah, you'd think so, but so are you saying that what are you implying here? So you're saying you kind of would like to go in that direction? I think we talked about this before.
Well, so it's interesting. The Jews actually pride themselves on never actually having executed a kid due to this law.
Right.
And they're like, this was so extreme, we never actually had to do it. And so that sort of gives them a little bit of comfort. But I believe it's in Mark 7, Jesus brings up this passage and condemns the Pharisees for not practicing it. Which is, the first time somebody brought that up to me, I was like, no. And then I read it and I was like, whoa. Whoa, Jesus said that? Like,
yeah, could you read that?
Yeah, Mark 7, 8 through 13. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men. And he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, if a man tells his father or his mother, whatever you would have gained from me is korban, that is given to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your own tradition that you have handed down, and many such things you do.
Well, is that a condemnation of them not actually executing them, or is it more of a condemnation of them using it to gain money?
So yeah, the korban was, so if a kid basically, instead of supporting his parents in their old age, instead of doing that, if a kid wanted to say, I'm going to take all of my money and I'm going to give it to God, Jesus is saying you're nullifying Moses' commandment that children are not allowed to revile their parents. You've nullified that commandment by allowing them to dedicate whatever money would have gone to their parents to God instead.
Sure. I just thought that the korban, there was some kind of, they gained something out of this potentially, right? Didn't they get some of this money potentially?
The temple did, or they dedicated it to God, which I think could have been for any purposes. So
right, that's what I'm saying. So I mean, it also seems to be kind of a condemnation of sort of the corrupt nature of how they're applying the law, right? Instead of saying like, oh, instead of actually applying the law, you're just taking money for yourself, and just shows a condemnation of that.
But the condemnation, he specifically, the commandment that they're nullifying specifically was a child who reviles his father or mother must surely die. And Jesus said they have nullified that commandment by allowing children to dedicate their stuff to God.
That's interesting. Well, I mean, I have to look more into that, but
Going back to the very beginning when you wanted everyone here to bring their spouses, with further opinion on that passage you read from Deuteronomy, what we believe especially about how the Old Testament changes into the New Testament, and Karen brought up mortal sin, right? And so basically, to get so intoxicated you lose your reason, right, on anything, that would be a mortal sin.
Well, right. I mean, because there's different levels of drunkenness, right? And also, just going beyond just getting drunk on like one occasion to being like a continuous drunk, right? Which seems to be happening with this particular guy, or was that the guy with his mother, or was that like a drug-related thing?
He apparently had a history of drug abuse, and so his mom knew that he was going to go buy drugs. He was asking his mom for a ride, and she knew he was using that to buy drugs.
Right, and to sort of link this to the idea of, and you said like, the Bible doesn't really expressly talk about drugs as we think of them now, but I think that's a useful metric as well, is whether you're like taking away your use of reason, right? Like whether you're actually able to, if you're not under the influence of some substance or something like this, as far as your faculties and things of that nature, right? Because like when you drink any kind of alcohol, you're almost certainly affected in some way, right? Like if you drink alcohol, and I think drinking alcohol is fine with moderation, but it's once you get past a part where you are not able to control your emotions and control your faculties. I think that's kind of the deciding line, right? And so this, to me, that's one of the reasons why I kind of look askance at marijuana, for example. And I don't know what your guys' opinions on marijuana is. Marijuana seems to, if you're actually using it in any capacity, I mean, I guess you can microdose marijuana or something like this. And you can, I guess, to a certain extent.
Very rarely for medical uses.
Or something, or you can take it a little bit or whatever, right? But it always basically takes away your faculties of reason to a certain extent, it seems like to me. So that's why I kind of look askance at marijuana. I mean, I don't know what your guys
as well
think.
as eating into your brain and actually killing your brain's, cells.
And
harming you.
I mean, I don't want to get too far off topic, but as far as you're talking specifically about the prerogative of the parents in this regard.
And so, I think that's one of the things that drew me to it was like, there's all these opinions on like how much is too much. Some people say, no, any marijuana is a sin. Some people are like, no, any alcohol is a sin. And some people are like, no, you can do, if you can have meth under control, then you can do meth. And there seems to be so many various opinions. And I think that this passage kind of solves all that, which is like, it's up to the parents. It's at the discretion of the parents, which seems like probably too nebulous, I think, for a lot of people's tastes.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, is if the parents are like proper Christians, I think that could work. But obviously there's plenty of parents who are not in the general area out there. And there's plenty of parents who will, do meth with their kids and get their kids around.
It's what is it? Alcohol? What is it?
Fetal alcohol
syndrome.
Fetal alcohol syndrome.
Yeah.
Sorry, did you?
No, go ahead.
I guess going back to my point when I started was why I brought up mortal sin was, so there is always that threat in the Old Testament. I'm not versed on it at all. I'm just going off that passage you said. I apologize, but there's that threat in the Old Testament that if you go to these excesses, your parents are liable, if you're so far gone to bring you up to execute you. I was thinking, well, in the New Testament, we have Catholics, we have mortal sin, right? And I can't remember the name, but there's Saint Louis, who's a king of France. I don't know which Louis, and his mother. There's a quote from her saying, "I would rather die than see you commit mortal sin," because mortal sin for us means when you go to hell, you die. Your soul dies, right? You don't have that sanctifying grace, right? So if you instill that sort of fear in our modern Catholic faith, if you instill that in your kid, sort of like if you go to these excesses, you could be executed. If you go to these excesses now, like with alcohol or drugs, you will lose your soul could die, right? And you could die at any moment. You will go to hell. And there is that fear, I think, if you bring them up right, that they could resonate with and keep that in their minds and have like, oh, there are long-term consequences to this. I mean, taking religion out of it, I guess any parent could do that, but it sort of doesn't have that sharp sting to it, right? Because it's just like in this world, oh, you could hurt someone else or hurt your body, but in the Catholic faith, there is that extra pressure of you will go to hell for eternity if you lose that sanctifying grace, if you die in mortal sin. And so the kid could, they'll remember that when they grow older, and then it'll naturally kind of turn them away towards that, those excesses. I mean, that was my thinking.
That reminds me of the story I heard about Spurgeon's mom when Charles Spurgeon was younger, and he was living a rebellious, sinful, wayward life. And his mom at one point, as the story goes, said to him, on your judgment day, when you stand before God and he condemns you to hell, your mother will be standing there and she will say, Amen. And obviously we see where Spurgeon ended up, so that worked out. But I think what it speaks to, and it gets to your point, is that this passage it really is kind of a wake-up call for parents to have that kind of stalwart faith where, we can debate whether they actually need to, today, whether parents should be bringing their wayward children to be executed. But regardless of that side of the debate, what parents, I think, for sure need is just a kind of almost like stoicism about their children, and they need an objectivity about their children and their children's sin and the state of their children's souls, to where they're willing to say, yeah, you're my child, I love you, but at the end of the day,
I'm accountable for how I raise you.
I'm accountable to God for how I raise you, and righteousness matters more to me than, clinging to earthly things. Jesus said, right, you must hate your mother and father and, right, brother and sister, and follow me. So we need this passage it's kind of a wake-up call for me to just remember, keep the main thing, and don't love your children in a twisted way. Love them in the right way, which means being willing to lose them.
Right. Well, and the last phrase of this Deuteronomy 21 passage is, all Israel shall hear and fear. And so it's not we have to apply the law perfectly and we have to get everybody who needs to die in order to have the best society and most righteous society. It's all you need to do is let the news of this person who's the worst of the worst in a given community, if you have this person executed, everybody else who's on a path who still has time to do a U-turn is going to hear about it. And then you're not going to have to do, that'll be enough for them to realize the severity of going that direction.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to get into more practical in air quotes, ideas of applying this, because I do think it's kind of interesting, somewhat the idea of what you're saying. I mean, I don't know exactly what you would prefer. Of
anything besides the drug war.
Sure. And
not anything, but anything more effective.
Right, and there is precedent to a certain extent of having laws on the books where there is kind of an ultimate penalty, but it's just not really ever applied, right? The classic example was actually homosexuality, right? Up until very recently, the early 2000s, there were laws against sodomy, right, on the books, and that was Lawrence v. Texas, I believe, was the case that they brought forward to purposely overturn these, and it was in Texas. So you're from Texas.
Well, and Idaho still has a penalty for adultery still on the books, but it hasn't been applied.
Right, and that's the thing is even though for a long period of time, I mean, there's celebrated cases that the media likes to bring up of, they got after this guy or this guy for being a homosexual or whatever, but generally speaking, it wasn't really something that was applied. But it was kind of understood, and it was sort of a placeholder for the idea in the culture at large, right? That homosexuality was a negative thing, it was a bad thing, and that we have on the books that we think it's a bad thing and you can be punished for it. They didn't generally punish people for it, but that was a thing, right? So the idea that a penalty can stand, for example, you talked about how the Israelites or whoever just never actually applied this law, but that it's kind of, I feel like there is a place in the law to have laws of aspiration, if that makes any sense. Isn't this is something that we should shows our ideals and we should aspire towards this, but it's not something that you actually really apply in real life, if that makes any sense. And I don't know if you're thinking of that in that direction.
I think that could certainly be a help.
Yeah, so I can kind of understand what you're saying.
The ideal is that obviously, hopefully, nobody ever crosses into needing that to be applied. But if it is there, and then if you do it once every 50 years or something, that's enough for everybody to be like, okay, yep, we're pulling back. We're gonna not let our kids go that direction.
Right, and also, I mean, I think there's a big thing, if you want to go larger in the discussion of war on drugs, to me, it's because, I mean, obviously a big part of the issue with drugs in our culture now is a lack of religiosity in the general populace, I think. But it's also because, frankly, there's just a proliferation of these different kinds of drugs we didn't have before. And it's easily accessible to people in a way that wasn't done before either. And while we had this war on drugs that started in the 70s, I guess, basically, under, I think it was Nixon who started officially use that terminology, from what I remember. It might have been later than that, but I think it was Nixon. And they put in this thing like, oh, because everyone's concerned about, various drugs and what was going on. And I think they're right to be concerned about this, but I just don't think it's really something that the government, frankly, is particularly interested in really solving. And I think they have put forward, some efforts as kind of showcases to do something about it. And they've obviously put a lot of money into it. People have made a lot of money off of it, right? With the
heard that certain jurisdictions will actually get certain levels of kickbacks. So they actually have an incentive for large drug deals to be allowed to occur, so that then they confiscate, and civil asset forfeiture means that they get a big bonus.
Right. So like corruption is tied into it as well. I think that. For example, I've lived in a more authoritarian, quote unquote, country, Russia, right? And they basically don't really have. They obviously have some drug issues, but it's not nearly the same as we have. In fact, in high schools now, a lot of kids do drugs. Even before marijuana was legal, kids would do marijuana and stuff like that. And that's basically unheard of, from what I understand in my experience in Russian high schools. And I worked in some Russian high schools. Kids would get drunk, they'd drink in class, and they would drink in the bathroom and stuff like this, but it's basically alcohol. The drug issues that we just take for granted in America are just really not a thing over there. Mm-hmm. And I think it's partly because of the strictness of the enforcement. They're very much, you'll be put in jail for a long time if you have any kind of drug stuff, right? But it's also, it's also a geographical thing. Obviously, we're right over South America, and we have access to all these drugs that come up through Mexico. And we don't really control the border, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also just a cultural thing and an enforcement thing in large part. So there's this war on drugs, and there's these punishments that are doled out supposedly, and as you've experienced, they can be rather unfair. And I've seen this myself working in the legal field, is how you'll have some poor sap who is an addict, and so he'll just get. Then the police know who he is, and they'll just pull him over and over again and charge him over and over and over again for these drug things. It's not really solving anything. He's still addicted. Yeah. He still has this issue, right? But anyway, I don't know what direction you're going with the discussion here. I
think there's definitely depending on the culture at large, there are certain, the civil government has been given the job to, they're supposed to punish the evildoer and reward the righteous, right? Those are their generally framed purposes. And then we look for specifics what does that actually look like? And we can look at Old Testament law to figure out, okay, well, what might some of the specifics of that kind of look like? But those are the general guidelines. And we see throughout the Old Testament different kings, some called good kings, also acting slightly outside the judicial law, but having to use what was required of them at the time to protect their people and to punish the evildoer. And so I think there has to be some level of give and take when it comes to, drug war, that sort of thing. And yes, it totally gets corrupted, and there's lots of corruption today, but their job is to protect the righteous and punish the evildoer. And so they are called to root out the things that are corrupting our country. And so it's
hopefully before it gets to an extreme capital case level.
Yeah. And
If
so
you can curb something before it gets to there, then please do that.
yeah. So it's like they're called to do that, and there's and the level of force has to rise to meet the level of evil that's involved, right? So like it is, moving outside the family now. Okay, your kid is grown up, they're in society, they're not directly under their parents' control anymore. So now they're kind of outside the jurisdiction of that law that talks about, okay, you were in the home, what were you supposed to, the parents take care of things, and that they've always got that in their mind, like this is really important. And then now they're outside the home and they're on their own. What does that look like now? Okay, how do we actually fix that? What do we do to rein this evil in? Like, what are the limits of that you see maybe judicially?
Well, yeah, there's kind of a catch-all given for like corporal punishment in the Old Testament as well. Not more than 40 stripes, and there's only ever one case given that specifically says stripes for this, which leads me to believe that there's actually a lot of other things that the judicial would have some discretion over. Exactly how many, for what kind of offenses. So let's say a kid is going in the direction of being rebellious, and his parents would not, they're nowhere near thinking, okay, it's time to take him for execution. There could still be a, disturbance of the peace level infraction where the judicial would say, like, okay, we're going to give you 3 lashes, and it's in public, so there's a little bit of a shame aspect to it, as opposed to putting somebody in jail for 90 days or fining him for being a public nuisance. It's no, the community needs to see that this guy, the judicial hopefully is, for the same reason you'd spank a kid. You want to break their spirit a little bit and make them teachable, because they've bucked up and they've become rebellious and they've crossed a line that could have hurt somebody. Praise God they didn't kill somebody when they were in a car accident, drinking and driving or whatever. But okay, maybe we impose a restitution for the damages you caused, and then also maybe the judicial can say, hey, we're going to do 3 stripes in public. And so to let the public know, hey, we're going to identify this guy. And so if it's sort of, I wonder if there's a factor of like, inferring deputization on all the people who witnessed that guy. Like, hey, if you see him, be on the lookout for this guy. If you see him, he has a tendency to go in this direction. If you see something, because you've seen him being publicly shamed like that, step in. If you see him getting into a car drunk, you know where this is going. You've seen the consequences of it with this guy specifically. Step in and pull him out of the car or something like that. I think that's a real, just sort of a natural progression of events.
Yeah.
It's a little ironic that, we're proposing some of these more biblical punishments, which many today would see as very heavy-handed, more authoritarian, almost in line with the drug war type heavy-handed, laws. And yet, prohibition, as we know in our own country's history, prohibition, the drug war, did not work out great, and it was heavy-handed, but it was heavy-handed in a pretty unbiblical way, and it involved a lot of, long,
because ultimately
sentences in jail, which
ultimately you need a reformation of the culture at the same time.
Yes,
like you can't have judicial sphere working without the church and the individual and the family working in revival, right? Like the darker a nation gets, the larger its government has to grow. But if we want it to actually work and not just restrain and just be, hard times, like be judged, then we need revival. Then we need people actually training their kids well.
Like John Adams said, our government requires a moral people. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
Like what you mentioned with prohibition, I have heard, I've never actually looked into this myself, but I'd be curious, from every time that I've heard somebody bring up the reason that prohibition passed was because when all the men were off at war, the women were the strongest voting bloc, and they're like, we're sick of our husbands coming home drunk and, beating us and things, which is all valid. And so it was actually the moms and the daughters that were concerned with the men's drunkenness. They passed prohibition. So
Yeah,
it's
it was
like,
definitely driven by women largely.
there's definitely and I think part of that is there's a biblical sense of that. Obviously, that was just misplaced into doing something that the government's not allowed to do. And I think it's because we've ignored passages like this, where it's like, no, actually, the mom is supposed to have a hand in curbing this, knowing that this is the final end result of all, perpetual drunkenness and rebellion is death. Your mother would be involved in that.
Yeah. Rather than just imprisonment, which is kind of nowhere in the Bible.
No, it's prohibited. Yeah.
Yeah. And it seems to make things worse.
I do wonder at what point a mother would actually, like a Christian mother, would actually do that, would be okay with that. Like you look at Monica with Augustine, like he was
Tell me that story.
doing so much. Like, I mean, he was, living with a girl. He was exploring all kinds of crazy religions. He was rebelling in all sorts of ways. He was, he would take care of her in a lot of ways, but he also kind of mocked her a little bit, a lot for her faith, holding to the things that she did. He went into the Manichees, he went into this, he went into that. Like he had a very tumultuous life, and he went into so many different things. She was weeping for him every day, praying for him every day. She went to great lows. And that was while she was raising him too. She could see that he was doing that, right? But
didn't she also, if I'm not mistaken, didn't she go to some other sort of authority to try to
she went to
him?
a priest.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, to try to influence him in some way. So,
yeah.
But she didn't try to have him executed, though.
Yeah, no.
So there is that distinction.
And I think that's for a reason.
I would think that a lot of mothers too would say like, "Hey, I don't want to have to do this."
Yeah.
You could at least remind the kid that this is in my prerogative.
I don't know that any mother, any true Christian mother, would even entertain that idea. I don't know that.
Hopefully not. I
think
think there is supposed to be biblically speaking, I think there is supposed to be a breaking point. I mean, getting back to the mortal sin thing, which I don't think I'm on board with even. But Jesus did say, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. But for it's better to enter heaven instead of your whole body be cast into hell.
Right.
So there is something to that effect. Like if a mother was concerned that her kid was about to commit a mortal sin, wouldn't it be better that he die before he commit that sin?
Sure, but what if you've already committed those sins? Like you're already in that state of doing this sort of thing, right? And that's to me is that is kind of the issue here. I mean, and that's why I've spoken about with you before. Is I think Old Testament jurisprudence is a model, but as to how it applies now, with the New Covenant and everything else, is kind of it's a bit different. And also,
Hebrews says that with a change in the priesthood, there's a change in the law as well. So there certainly has been a change. The question of, one of the impetuses behind this podcast is, to what extent.
Sure, right.
Discussing that out.
And also, it's how much authority but obviously, like parents have authority over their children now up until they reach the age of maturity, or the age of majority, I believe is the term, 18 or whatever, right? And to a certain extent, right? And there's been, case law exploring what exactly you have rights over your child as far as when they're younger. But and you spoke of this guy who, his mother had this no contact order put on against him, but practically now, how much authority should a parent have over their child when they're an adult is kind of a question I have for you, right? So like, once they reach the age of majority, let's say are an adult, how does that flesh out? And it sounds like in the Old Testament, you still had some kind of authority, you still do. And I think people still think your parents do have authority of some sort, right, over you, even when you are an adult, at least as far as respect and things of that nature. But it's actually, what sort of control do they have over their kids once they're no longer in their home, once they're no longer a child, right? So
I think certainly with daughters, we've sort of swerved too far the other direction. Like I know a family where there was a guy interested in the family's daughter, and the dad said, no, you can't, you're not allowed to go with this guy. You know, I know who he is. I'm gonna cut this off now. And so.
And how old was she at the time?
I think she was 18 or 19. And so he started, the guy who was interested started inviting her out of the home. She was still living at home. He started inviting her out. He would never go, because he knew he couldn't go to their house and get away with anything. So he would invite her out. So, and she started going out, and he eventually sort of won her over, proposed to her. She said yes, and the dad said, no, you can't. But the state was like, we don't recognize a father's authority over his daughter because she's 18 now. And so the parents did not attend her wedding. They were not tagged in any of the photos on Facebook. It was just like their daughter is dead to them, basically.
Right. Okay. And what do you feel about that?
Oh, I think that the father is supposed to have some say.
Sure, and traditionally, up until relatively recently, there was the idea of like going to the father for permission to marry the daughter.
Well, because the Old Testament pattern is the father can nullify any vow that his daughter makes. And so if the father thinks that his daughter's making a rash vow, he can undo it. But if he either says yes or doesn't say anything for one day, then whatever she vows stands. And so essentially the dad did that. He's like, no, you are not. You did not say yes to this guy. I'm not going to allow that.
Do you know anything in particulars about why he particularly didn't like this guy? I'm just kind of curious.
Funnily enough, he was a youth pastor at their church.
Okay.
And so he was kind of a public figure at the church, and the dad had seen enough of his character to be like, no, I don't want him to be a son-in-law.
And so do you know what sort of negative character traits he had that he did not like?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't.
Interesting.
Actually, I had a thought going back to talking about earlier involving jail. Sounds to me like that jail just does not do a good job of deterring bad behavior, because you just get put away, and then after you get out of jail, unless you're on like probation or some sort of rules, you just go back to what you're doing. I mean, and when you brought up that public shaming thing of like, okay, you have to do some restitution, and then you get like 3 lashes in public. I think some sort of like public sort of like just consequence, or some sort of just like shame or like pain or something, right, as a consequence. Not just you go to a couple hearings, put in jail, maybe pay a fine. That's it. It's all like, it's all contained within yourself. But I mean,
there's no like immediate ramifications.
No
really,
immediate ramifications.
Other than, I mean, we've talked about this before, and I frankly chalked it up to an IQ issue, is that one of the reasons I actually agree with you somewhat about prison and jail is a lot of people who are inclined towards criminality, a large part of it has to do with the fact that they're not very smart, frankly. And not very smart people have a hard time with abstract thinking and thinking about the future, right? And so in the similar way to a child or a pet, you have to have immediate negative reaction to something they do. And frankly, corporal punishment would probably work better with a lot of people than long-term prison sentences, because to them, like, what's 50 years in prison? Like, that doesn't mean anything to
Hasn't happened yet.
Yeah,
well, funnily enough, you stick them in prison for 50 years, they don't mature socially because they're not around people.
Right.
And so you want them to mature, and so in order to force them to mature, you separate them from good influence with other people.
And that's the thing that's kind of surprising, and I didn't even know this until I went to law school, is that we had corporal punishment up until relatively recently too, and it was only considered unconstitutional or cruel and unusual punishment in the 60s, I believe, right? So they had corporal punishment in prisons and stuff like that. Of course, they're in prison, but still they did things like, I don't know if they did lashes, I don't exactly know, but it was some kind of corporal punishment they had. Right, and so to me, I spoke with you about this before outside of this podcast, but I think it's actually more cruel to lock someone up in a box for their entire life, essentially, rather than doing some sort of immediate punishment at the time. And I actually think that's more uncivilized in a lot of ways than to actually doing physical pain.
It feels like only half the equation, right? Like you're protecting the righteous from this person for a little bit, I guess.
Right.
But you're not actually doing the other half, which is punishing the person who you're putting in there. Like it's only half justice.
And you're in a sense punishing society because now
they have
we're
to pay
paying.
for it.
Yeah.
The stat you gave me, Adam, a while ago was we pay something around $40,000 a year per inmate in
The
America.
average annual salary, you basically just take that, and now this person is a drain.
Right.
Instead of producing that much, they now drain that much.
Oh, I see. Right. So,
So yeah, it's about 40,000.
okay.
And that's the ironic thing, though, is if you look at the history of the American prison system, America is one of the first countries in the world to do a prison system in that way and have long-term sentences back at the beginning of the country, because it was considered as being progressive and like this is this new thing, right? It's like because the
Maybe
idea
it just had been out of practice for a while, but the Egyptians and Mesopotamians did.
Sure, they had, but to make it this institutionalized thing where instead of getting corporal punishment or instead of execution, they'd put them in prison. And at the time, we were lauding ourselves on being so progressive by doing this.
But then, funnily enough, if you would ask most people who are being sentenced, would you prefer 15 lashes or 90 days in jail? They would say 15 lashes, please. I've got a job and I don't want to get my trailer taken away.
Yeah, exactly, right. But then it's a big thing, which I think I spoke to you about before as well, is it's a huge problem I feel with our society as a whole now is this great emphasis on harm avoidance, right? Is that like pain or harm of any sort is like the biggest thing to avoid, and we don't want, and then to them it's like, and also just chalks of being uncivilized to use corporal punishment on someone because it involves physical injury or pain or blood, right? And so anything involving those things is considered like icky and uncivilized, which is why, as far as like execution is concerned, we've moved progressively away from more visceral forms of execution to like now it's lethal injection, which is this very medicalized form of doing these things, which I actually think is more uncivilized and it's more barbaric.
It numbs the aversion that brutal process is supposed to give the public to say, this is dangerous.
Right, and it's just like, oh, they're just going to sleep. Well, and then of course there's a further problem, which the anti-execution crowd always points to, and they actually have a point about this, is that the people doing these lethal injections, they're not trained doctors, they don't know what they're doing, they mess it up a lot, and they end up
because you can't get medical because of the Hippocratic Oath.
Yeah, well, they're just not going to be doing that, and so it's like these untrained people who might have been like a like one of those ambulance people called
EMTs.
EMT. They might have been an EMT maybe or something like this, but they're not trained medically, and they cause oftentimes there's these cases they bring up of very painful deaths coming from lethal injection and et cetera, et cetera. It's like, well, that's because frankly it'd be probably less painful for this person to just be hanged or shot, or even guillotined or something like this. But they don't like those things because it seems like, as I said, uncivilized, which is this kind of aversion against any kind of harm or really, it's kind of like anti-reality. Like they want to live in like a fantasy of what we should be, and anything that death kind of creeps in there. We want to get death as far away as possible from us, and so we go in that direction. But we're getting a little bit far.
Well, yeah, it's just, and I know you've got something, Zach, but there's sort of the police take this person and he just sort of isn't here anymore.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened. He was just taken somewhere far away. Yeah. Meanwhile, prison guards have like the highest suicide rate of anybody in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so no, they go somewhere, and they still, the effects of that person's character not being dealt with and being put in a hole.
Mm-hmm. What also makes them worse, right? And this is something
if they ever get out, yeah, it's worse.
Well, right, because they go into the prison system. I mean, this is well documented in Soviet Russia, right? Like the Soviets instituted the Gulag system, this very elaborate prison system. And it was, I mean, they had prisons obviously before in Tsarist times, but the Soviets made it this huge thing, right? And again, it was their form of their being progressive in the way they treat the state and how they treat people. And so, but in the process, they greatly made worse any sort of organized crime, right? So the Russian organized crime, as it is now, comes from the Gulag system, and they didn't really have organized crime before the Gulag system. So they go into this and they meet with other criminals, are all together in the same place, and this just makes their situation worse, and it makes their behavior worse.
You have the non-intellectually stunted, are then in control of all the rest, like you were saying earlier.
You get to set up your own hierarchy in a controlled environment where you would have just probably shot each other in the street before. Now you have time to commiserate. And
I think that's, and there's plenty of movies and TV shows that allude to this, like how our prison system, like they have all these various gangs in prison now, and then it just makes the gang system worse, right? Because they're getting involved with that.
They learn a lot of new things. They end up coming out of prison a lot worse than they went in.
Yeah, a lot of
thermite. What is that?
Yeah.
Right.
What did you have, Zach?
I've got lots of thoughts brewing right now. I think just to sum up some of what we've been saying in the last few minutes, like it seems like Christians are really up against a lot of things that hinder what actually promotes a flourishing society. So obviously the prisons is a big one, but the Christian father who, let's say he does have good eyes in his head and he sees that this man is not good for his daughter, like he's up against a legal system that tells him kind of
must allow this.
Yeah, screw you. Like you can't let her, you must let them get married. We know a couple right now that's, going through a divorce, and you're just seeing ways in which the husband might be able to make good arguments from a biblical standard for why this divorce would be wrong, but they mean nothing in a court of law, and he can't really point to any of that as evidence when they're talking about custody, because the legal system just doesn't care about that stuff. And so
that's why I'm a fan of church courts.
Right. I've heard you talk about this before. Like as much as we can, if we can start developing our own punishments or courts and show the world that we do it better and it's healthier, it's quicker, it's cheaper, it's generally...
The playpen has been reduced to what the church is allowed to do that's binding, that the government doesn't. They're like, sure, you can do whatever you want to do, like family counseling, sure, fine.
Right.
But then as soon as it gets anything more serious, it's like, nope, it's time for daddy to take over.
Yep.
And church has no more responsibility over it. Now, that whole system is predicated on you have to have people who are willing to not go to outsiders. Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians. He's like, isn't it better to be defrauded than to go to law against one another before outsiders?
Yeah.
And that way of thinking has just completely exited the Christian mind.
Mm-hmm. But how do we end the prison system? We're up against a Goliath here, and so it's going to be... I think we'll get there, but it'll be a long time.
Well, also a big part of it is it's a big money maker, right?
Yeah.
It's a big industry. So when you get money involved, it makes it even
one of the alternatives to the prison, a biblical alternative to the prison system, because the Bible, by way of one level of inference, forbids prisons. You're not allowed to take a man's work tools as collateral for a debt. Mm-hmm. Okay, but you can take his hands and his feet and his whole body. Those aren't his tools.
Right.
And it says the reason you can't take a millstone from a guy is because, the principle is he needs to work to pay back for the debt. If you take his ability to work away from him, I would say locking this person up in a room where he can't interact with anybody is a worse ignoring of that law than you can't take his millstone. It says the reason you can't take his millstone is because that would be binding his life. So you can't take his millstone because that's binding his life, but you can bind his body. That's not his life. It doesn't quite work. But slavery, there's supposed to be profitability in slavery, and it's a better system. Lawful slavery, which is this person now has to go and work back and work until their debt is paid for. There's supposed to be profit in that for the owner, or else, just lock them up.
Yeah.
Well, we have slavery already through the prison system now, essentially.
It's a more perverse form of slavery.
Right. They're actually doing, it's essentially slave labor, and they, it's somewhat limited, I guess. They're making like license plates or whatever, and they get paid like a cent.
They used to. Texas, that was a big deal, but they've done away with that. They don't do that anymore.
Well, I don't exactly know what they're doing. I know they do use them to do some labor things.
But funnily enough, the people in jail that I have had contact with, they fall all over themselves work in the kitchen, and because it helps the time go by faster.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And good work makes us happier, just on a psychological level.
Even though, I mean, there are some guys that will go out and they'll literally work the cotton fields and stuff, and they'll get paid, 3 cents a day. In 2025, they'll get paid 3 cents a day for working in cotton fields. So it's like, it's just a different kind of slavery.
Yeah.
But it's an unlawful as opposed to a biblically lawful kind of slavery.
So back to capital punishment as a better means in many cases for restraining evil. What do you guys make of the argument that folks bring up who are against capital punishment? They say they'll point to just historically where capital punishment has been on the books. It hasn't deterred crime like we would expect. Have you heard this brought up?
I've heard it.
Yeah.
The statistic I have heard people bring up in response to that is having it on the books does nothing.
Sure.
Enforcing it
Right.
does.
Right. Okay.
So in states where the death penalty is actually practiced,
I think there's
rates of capital crime are lower.
Yeah. And if we were to make it a public thing, that would probably be a more deterrent.
Yeah, I think there's also a blessing. It's ironic. God has used the Democrats today, I think, to restrain what could be a much, much worse, ordinarily in the past, when a nation becomes this anti-Christian, deaths of Christians start to occur, right? Rome, Greece, all over the place this happens.
Sure.
But today, we live in an anti-Christian nation, mostly, and we don't have that en masse quite yet, which is really, and the blessing is God has put in a lot of kind of weak people who just don't like the idea like that. Like you were saying, that's an icky feeling to them, which is a huge blessing because it's like, oh, thank goodness you hate us, but
They won't kill us.
yes. So it's almost like in the moment, not having the death penalty is a blessing because of who is in power, right? Which is a direct result of who is underneath and who put them in power. So it's almost like having a death penalty is a rarely used, like you were saying, 50 years, maybe every 50 years or more, rarely used thing in a properly governed nation where the people are governing themselves. And then suddenly you just get so messed up as a people that it's just like, look, I don't even know where to start. What in the world if we flip the switch, all right, every state you now must execute for the following, like, oh my goodness, there'd be rioting, there would be chaos, there would be...
That's why I don't want that. That's why I'm a fan of the Christian courts, because then we can have people that agree to it, and if you don't like it, then leave the church. Go somewhere else where people are not as quote unquote crazy, or maybe genuinely crazy.
Well, I mean, that's the thing is, I don't think it would cause as much disruption as you'd think, because again, for example, now according to the U.S. Supreme Court, you're only allowed to be executed for some form of murder, right? But that's like again a more relatively recent thing. And actually, I think this should be reversed because I think we should execute these people. But within the last 20 years, if I'm not mistaken, they had the court case which basically said they can't execute child rapists, for example. And I think that should be allowed back. And I think the public would be in favor of bringing some of that stuff back for certain
Florida
crimes.
just recently passed something that said if you rape a child that's 12 or younger, the death penalty is on the books again in Florida.
Right. I mean, they're trying to do that, but it's already been determined to be unconstitutional. So maybe they're trying to get that overturned, I'm assuming is what they're doing.
Well, what
Or
about
just nullify it.
what about how would you dole out punishments and the severity of them to, say, like drug dealers or drug manufacturers? How would you go about dealing with them if we're gonna do this sort of?
I think the way that you deal with them is you dry up their customer base. If there was a death penalty for certain people in a community because they've gone too far and their parents have taken them and have them executed, that's going to have everybody that's on them basically be responsible for initiating their own U-turn.
Yeah.
Because they're like, oh, I'm headed to death, which a lot of people are anyway. They just overdose, and they did it themselves. And so in that sense, it's a lot more peaceful. But there are, I think, a lot of people who would be prevented from dying from drug abuse by executing rampant offenders whose own mother is like, I think he's past that point.
Sure, I mean, that is one way, but I actually somewhat disagree. I think it would be more effective to target the distributors and the drug dealers, and I think we have an example of this working in real life from relatively recently. It was in the Philippines, and I don't know if you've heard about this, but they had a president recently, about 10 years ago now. His name was Duterte, and he's kind of considered this radical, but he basically made it a law that you were allowed to kill drug dealers. Just straight up, you were allowed to kill them.
Wow.
And a lot of drug dealers died, and then apparently their drug problem got a lot better pretty quickly, actually. And that's one way to do it. And I don't think that's the best way to do it, obviously, because it's kind of this anarchic situation.
Collateral damage.
Sure, but and also, someone can say, obviously they can say, this person was a drug dealer and I killed him, right? But they did that, and it did work, right? So I do think targeting drug distribution stuff does work because they are the ones who you can make the argument they're ultimately more at fault than the people who take the drugs, right? Because they oftentimes these kids get hooked on them at some young age or whatever, and where they have to have access to these drugs, right? And they're, like I said, they're pervasive. So targeting those people, I mean, it's kind of like the same argument with if you want to stop illegal immigration. If you really want to stop it, you have to target very severely the people who are hiring the illegal immigrants, right? And the illegal immigrants, this will cause that to go down significantly, which it would, right? And so that to me is, yes, you should make punishment for the actual users, but to me, it would help significantly if you more severely punish the distributors and the suppliers.
I can see a level of reasoning, and we can wrap up soon, but I can see a level of reasoning from that. There's a passage that says, anybody who steals a man or anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. Mm-hmm. So I think that could be a way of the illegal slave trade, which is you kidnap this guy. The person buying him from you is also liable to be killed. So he's going to ask for, was he made a slave lawfully? Because if he wasn't, and then somebody finds out that I bought him and I'm in possession of him, I die, even though I didn't enslave him. There could be a level of that for responsibility. Same thing, you might also be able to get into tort law, just the same thing in medicine. If you give somebody contaminated drugs and they die, there's a way to figure out who was responsible for that up the chain.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's...
I think people die from, fentanyl. That's just filthy. There's just other stuff in it because it's been... what's the word?
It's been corrupted,
it's been fillers have been added to it, and
sure, it's
the
been
fillers
watered down.
were nasty and had worse effects and killed people.
Well, fentanyl itself is also just very, very dangerous stuff. A very small amount of it can cause you to overdose, but it's a huge problem. Like I've seen this in our work, is so many people getting caught with fentanyl. Like it's just so pervasive now. It's basically almost wiped out every other drug except for meth is still kind of holding on a little bit around here. But fentanyl is kind of the go-to one because it's so cheap, right? It's very cheap to make. You can make a lot of it, and it's a lot cheaper than methamphetamine even, which was the big thing, like 10, 20 years ago. But now it's it's fentanyl. It's kind of everywhere at this point. Can I ask you guys, what you personally think about marijuana? I'm just kind of curious.
Ooh.
Yeah. I think it's medical marijuana is totally, I think it's usable in small dosage. It's a natural, it's a natural plant. Mm-hmm. A lot like tobacco or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And those things in moderation.
So is hemlock.
Indeed.
Yes. Ayahuasca.
Yeah. Yes.
Not that I disagree with
but
that.
I think
just being facetious.
Yeah. But I think the pleasure-seeking use of it typically ends very, very badly. Mm-hmm. And it's not wise or safe or something. I think that if a civil government is looking to actively protect its citizens, I think that should be on its list. It should be fairly low on the list, but I think it should definitely still be on the list of like, hey, this is, we got a tip that you're doing marijuana in here. That should definitely be a regular.
No, that was a skunk.
Yeah, right.
My general take on probably all drugs is there's probably a Christian use for them, a good righteous use, just like there can be a righteous use of tobacco and alcohol and caffeine, and we all know what
righteous use.
Yeah, right. But we all know what that looks like, and we also all know what an unrighteous use of caffeine, alcohol, tobacco looks like. I think you can apply the same to all drugs. I know several people who have used cannabis in various forms for purely healthy uses. And so my guess is that we could probably find good uses for those other even harder drugs. But
I know people will get addicted to opioids because of painkillers in the hospital. And
Right.
painkiller, that's a perfectly lawful use.
Right.
I don't see any problem with that. But then they get out and they're like, oh, I still have a craving for something. And this street drug fills that urge.
I think of I actually just was kind of looking up some scripture before this podcast, but 1 Timothy 4:4 says, "For everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving, for it is made holy by the word of God and prayer." So I can see that applying to a lot of these things, and Christians can be pretty skittish about potentially using drugs for good, but I think we need to be a little more stalwart and open to the idea that God made these things. And
I think there's, always, in that context, most of the things that Timothy was referring to were the things that the ceremonial law said don't participate in. So, shellfish, and don't eat pork or bacon, or, and of course it also covers drugs, but in that context, those were not directly harmful things. In the same way, I mean, shellfish and pork do carry diseases that we now know about, and we can, cook them the right way to remove the diseases. So God actually helped to keep his people from dying of tons of sicknesses that they never would have known about, just by telling them, hey, don't eat these foods, when everybody else around them is dying of these illnesses, and they're like, what's wrong with them? Why are they doing it? And God's like, well, I saved you from it by not
Moses
having
told us to dig a hole behind us and then cover it over after we're done.
Yeah, exactly.
Other countries, they just throw it out the kitchen window.
Yeah. And so God
street.
preserves his people through those sorts of things. And so that, of course, is true. But I also think that in that context, there are not exactly things that are harmful to you. Like eating meat cooked the right way is not going to, you can eat as much of that as you want, generally.
You can eat raw beef if it's handled the right way.
Yeah,
it's
but like
beef tartare.
Marijuana, you go back to it like 2 or 3 times,
right,
and you're going to your brain is going to start to degrade. You're going to become addicted to it. You're going to become, and it will have detrimental effects on you, both in your ability to have self-control, which is what we're called to do as Christians. We're meant to be self-controlled people. Several people can have this same thing with alcohol, where they just can't get enough of it. They take one sip and they're like, oh, I need more. Well, for that person, they need restraint. Like, they actually need to excuse themselves from the room when people are drinking. That's an actual legitimate thing for them that they need to avoid. So I think it's hard to make these like
blanket statements.
Yeah. But I think that there are uses for it, but it's a much more nuanced, as opposed to methamphetamine, which is just like,
yeah, I don't really.
That
see
one's
the
pretty
designed
fairly
to
cut and dry. Yeah,
never get off of it, basically.
Yeah.
There's very little natural about meth.
Yeah.
You don't like the brewing process? You don't think that's natural?
I love chemistry.
Yeah, I grew up in a family where my parents didn't drink alcohol. They might have had a glass of wine or something on Christmas or Thanksgiving, but I don't even remember them ever doing that. As we got older, and my brother and I started asking, like, Dad, like, I'm drinking age now. What would you think if I, had a Mike's Hard Lemonade or something? And so we started talking about it at that point. And I know my brother enjoys drinking. He's never gotten drunk, never had more than, I think, probably 2 or 3 drinks in an entire day is the most he's ever had. And then I've just recently developed an allergy to alcohol, so I couldn't even drink if I wanted to.
That's interesting.
And then, so yeah, for marijuana, but that's the thing. Like, I don't necessarily have a problem with somebody who smokes marijuana. I never have. I've never smoked a cigarette. It's not something that's on my radar. I think that's also somebody with fetal alcohol syndrome. That person is going to literally has a diagnosable medical condition as a propensity to drinking and all these other things that come along with it because their parents drank while they were in the womb. I think that's one of the reasons that Moses does give kind of a wide berth for it. It's up to the parents. Like, if I started smoking marijuana, I think my parents would probably be disappointed, just because of the stigma in the church that is around it. And I think a lot of that is a good stigma. Yeah, it's good to have sort of preliminary boundaries of, we're not going to kill you if you go past this, but please don't do that. And that's sort of the first step towards, like, I told you there's a cliff over there. Don't play anywhere near there. Right. Yeah. And for one mom, 100 feet might be too close, and for another mom, 200 feet might be too close. Yeah. So it's up to each parent is accountable to God for how they raise their children, and the end of that is death. Whether your parents execute you or you die of an overdose, one way or another, there is death at the end of the line somewhere. And so I think it's important to put up safeguards, not in a legalistic way, but the reason that parents don't let their kids play in the street is not because it's a sin to play in the street. It's because you can very easily get run over. And so don't do that.
Yeah.
Amen.
That's good.